The world Cleopatra entered was already carrying the weight of its own long goodbye. Egypt still breathed, still moved through ritual days and sacred nights, but the strength that had once lifted stones and bent rivers had softened into memory. Temples stood intact, their walls carved with gods who had ruled longer than any dynasty, yet the prayers whispered beneath them were quieter now, more habitual than hopeful. The Nile still flooded on schedule, still brought life from silt and water, but even that ancient rhythm could not disguise the feeling that Egypt was living on borrowed time. Power lingered here the way heat lingers after sunset, real but fading, unable to hold back the coming dark. Beyond Egypt's borders, the Mediterranean was changing its voice. Rome no longer spoke as a city among equals, but as a force that absorbed, reorganized, and decided the future of others with unsettling calm. Its legions moved like machinery across land and sea, not driven by ritual or ancestry, but by systems, discipline, and an appetite that seemed endless. Kingdoms that once negotiated as peers now survived only through accommodation. Egypt, once the center of gravity for the ancient world, had become a prize discussed in distant rooms by men who would never walk its sacred courts. The Ptolemaic dynasty still ruled, but its authority had thinned into performance. Greek by blood and Egyptian by necessity, its kings and queens balanced between cultures without fully belonging to either. The court spoke Greek, read Greek philosophy, and traced its legitimacy to Alexander, yet it ruled a people whose identity was far older and deeper. Power required constant reassurance. Coins were struck, ceremonies repeated, titles proclaimed again and again, as if saying them often enough might make them true. Behind the splendor, debts accumulated, loyalties fractured, and Rome quietly tightened its grip through loans, treaties, and favors that could never be repaid without surrender. Cleopatra was born into this atmosphere of beauty edged with unease. She did not arrive at the height of an empire, but in its late afternoon, when light still fills the sky yet shadows grow longer each hour. The palace at Alexandria was a place of learning and suspicion, lined with scrolls and watched by servants who understood how quickly favor could turn to danger. Knowledge was valued here, but so was silence. Children learned early that survival depended less on innocence than on awareness. Every glance carried meaning. Every alliance contained risk. Egypt itself had become a stage where history repeated familiar movements without the strength that once powered them. Processions still wound through cities. Priests still chanted ancient names. Statues still gazed forward with timeless calm. Yet beneath this continuity lay dependence. Grain fed Rome. Money flowed outward. Decisions that once emerged from the Nile's banks were now influenced by distant senates and generals. Egypt was no longer shaping the world. It was being shaped by it. Rome's presence was not always visible, but it was always felt. Roman officials passed through Alexandria with casual authority, their words carrying more weight than titles carved in stone. Roman armies did not need to invade to dominate. They simply waited, knowing that economic pressure and internal rivalry would eventually invite them in. Egypt's rulers understood this, even if they could not openly admit it. Their task was no longer conquest or expansion, but delay. Each year preserved was a victory. Each compromise bought time. This was the inheritance Cleopatra received before she ever wore a crown. She was shaped by a world that taught her patience before power and calculation before confidence. The stories she absorbed were not of beginnings, but of endurance. She learned that Egypt's greatness lived in its past, while its future depended on negotiation, adaptation, and restraint. Survival was no longer a matter of armies, but of minds. The city of Alexandria mirrored this tension. It was vibrant, intellectual, alive with debate and commerce, yet constantly aware of its vulnerability. Scholars argued beneath colonnades while merchants tracked Roman markets with anxious precision. Ships arrived daily, carrying news of shifting alliances and rising men in Rome whose ambitions would soon reach Egypt's shores. Nothing felt settled. Everything felt provisional. Cleopatra's childhood unfolded within this fragile equilibrium. She did not grow up believing the world would bend to her will. She grew up understanding that the world was already bending away. That knowledge settled quietly, shaping her instincts long before she acted on them. Egypt had not fallen yet, but it was leaning toward its end, and everyone within its walls felt the tilt, even if they did not speak of it aloud. This chapter of her story is not one of drama, but of atmosphere, of silence between ceremonies, of the slow realization that history does not always announce its turning points with thunder. Sometimes it simply keeps moving forward while ancient worlds struggle to keep pace. Cleopatra would later be remembered as a singular figure, but she was first and foremost a child of decline, formed by a civilization that had outlived its moment. The inevitability of her story begins here, not with her choices, but with the conditions that shaped them. Egypt's beauty remained real. Its learning endured. Its rituals still connected Earth to eternity. Yet none of these could stop the larger movement of power flowing westward. Cleopatra was born into a world that still believed in itself, even as history had already begun to look elsewhere. And so, before her name carried meaning, before alliances and losses defined her, Cleopatra existed within a quiet truth, that some lives are shaped not by the rise of nations, but by their long, graceful descent. Cleopatra's childhood did not unfold in comfort so much as in awareness. The palace at Alexandria was grand, but it was never gentle. Its corridors carried knowledge and rumor in equal measure, and a child growing within those walls learned quickly that listening mattered more than speaking. Servants moved carefully, scholars debated softly, and guards stood as reminders that protection and danger often shared the same space. Cleopatra absorbed this atmosphere not as something remarkable, but as normal. Power, she learned, was never relaxed. It watched itself constantly. Her education reflected this reality. She was taught ceremony, of course, the gestures and titles required to rule Egypt, but those lessons were only the surface. Beneath them lay language, history, and memory. Greek came easily, as it did to her family, but she was also taught Egyptian, not as an ornament but as necessity. To speak to her people directly was to claim legitimacy without intermediaries. It was an unusual choice for a Ptolemaic ruler, and it revealed something early about how she was being prepared. Authority, she was taught, could not rely solely on tradition. It had to be renewed continuously. Philosophy entered her life not as abstraction, but as discipline. She studied logic and rhetoric not to impress, but to understand how arguments were constructed and dismantled. She learned how words could narrow choices or expand them, how silence could unsettle more deeply than accusation. History was not presented as triumphal narrative, but as warning. Dynasties rose and fell not because the gods willed it, but because rulers misjudged alliances, overestimated loyalty, or failed to adapt when the world shifted beneath them. These lessons were never framed as fear. They were framed as preparation. Cleopatra watched court politics closely. She observed how siblings became rivals without ceremony, how favor shifted with health, age, and Roman opinion. Love was rarely pure here. Loyalty was conditional. Even blood could be outweighed by advantage. This environment did not harden her into cruelty, but it sharpened her sense of reality. She learned that survival depended on reading people accurately and acting at the right moment, not too early and never too late. Her intelligence emerged quietly, without display. She did not challenge openly or seek to dominate discussion. Instead, she listened, storing information, measuring tone, learning which words provoked and which soothed. Those around her sometimes mistook this restraint for passivity. It was not. It was calculation shaped by caution. Cleopatra understood that in a world already strained, drawing attention too soon could be fatal. Egypt's position in the Mediterranean reinforced these lessons. Rome's influence pressed constantly against the palace walls, visible in envoys, financial obligations, and subtle expectations. Cleopatra was taught to see Rome not as enemy or savior, but as reality. Resistance without leverage led to destruction. Submission without dignity led to erasure. Survival lay somewhere between, in negotiation, timing, and understanding what Rome valued at any given moment. These were not romantic lessons. They were practical ones. As a girl, she did not imagine herself reshaping the world. She imagined preserving a space within it. Her ambition, if it can be called that, was grounded in continuity rather than conquest. Egypt, she understood, did not need another conqueror. It needed someone who could hold it together long enough for its voice to remain heard. That understanding became her foundation. Even moments of learning carried an edge. Tutors could be dismissed. Advisors could disappear. Alliances formed one season and dissolved the next. Cleopatra internalized these patterns, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. This was the cost of proximity to power. The palace was not a refuge from instability. It was its center. Physical presence mattered as much as intellect. She was taught how to enter a room, how to hold attention without demanding it, how to remain composed under scrutiny. These lessons were subtle, passed on through example rather than instruction. She learned that fear revealed itself in posture, that confidence could be projected without arrogance, that restraint often unsettled opponents more than aggression. Her formation as a ruler was not guided by destiny or prophecy. It was guided by pressure. Each year reinforced the same truth. Egypt could not afford mistakes. Cleopatra could not afford innocence. Survival became her first discipline, not as instinct, but as cultivated skill. She learned to anticipate threat without becoming consumed by it, to plan without illusion, to adapt without surrendering identity. By the time she approached adulthood, Cleopatra was not yet a queen, but she was already shaped by the responsibilities that awaited her. She understood the fragility of the throne she might one day occupy and the forces that circled it. Her intelligence was not brilliance for display. It was endurance sharpened into awareness. This chapter of her life does not end with triumph or declaration. It ends with readiness. Cleopatra emerged from her youth not with certainty, but with capacity. She was trained to survive in a world that rewarded flexibility over force and memory over pride. In a kingdom already leaning toward its end, she became what that moment required. Not a dreamer of revival, but a ruler prepared to meet pressure without illusion. Cleopatra inherited the throne at a moment when power in Egypt no longer rested on strength, but on balance so delicate it could fracture without warning. The system she entered had been designed over generations to prevent any single ruler from becoming too secure. Shared rule diluted authority. Family ties doubled as threats. Tradition offered legitimacy, but not protection. Ascension did not mark the beginning of control. It marked exposure. She ruled alongside her younger brother, as custom required, though custom had long since lost its stabilizing force. The pairing was ceremonial, intended to reassure both court and populace that order continued unchanged. In practice, it created paralysis. Advisors aligned themselves not with Egypt, but with factions. Decisions slowed. Trust evaporated. Cleopatra understood quickly that her title did not guarantee obedience. Every order required reinforcement. Every gesture was observed for weakness. The palace, once a place of education, now revealed its sharper edges. Conversations ended abruptly when she entered a room. Smiles carried calculation. Messages were filtered, delayed, reshaped. Authority reached her only after passing through layers of interest and resistance. Cleopatra adjusted without complaint. She learned to read absence as carefully as presence, delay as a form of opposition. Power did not announce itself. It had to be inferred. Rome's presence loomed over every internal conflict. Egypt's independence existed largely because Rome allowed it to. That knowledge shaped the court's behavior and sharpened its rivalries. Some sought favor through compliance, others through resistance carefully staged as tradition. Cleopatra recognized that neither approach offered safety. Rome respected usefulness, not loyalty. Egypt's value lay in its grain, its location, its stability. To appear unstable was to invite intervention. Within this environment, Cleopatra's position weakened not through error, but through structure. Her intelligence and restraint threatened those who benefited from confusion. Advisors who felt sidelined turned to her brother's name, using him as a shield for their own ambitions. Accusations circulated quietly, framed as concern for tradition. Cleopatra did not respond publicly. She understood that defending oneself too loudly could appear desperate. Still, the ground shifted beneath her. When exile came, it was not sudden. It arrived through incremental loss. Authority eroded. Access narrowed. Decisions were reversed or ignored. Eventually, she found herself removed not only from power, but from proximity to it. Forced from Alexandria, Cleopatra left behind the symbols of rule without illusion that symbols would protect her. The city closed its gates not in hostility, but in indifference. Power had simply moved elsewhere. Exile stripped the court of its illusions. Away from ceremony and echoing halls, Cleopatra confronted the reality of her position. She was queen in name, displaced in fact. Resources dwindled. Allies revealed their limits. Yet this removal did not weaken her resolve. Clarified it. She saw with painful precision how Egypt's monarchy had hollowed itself out, preserving ritual while abandoning cohesion. Her exile was not anomaly. It was consequence. She did not retreat into bitterness. Instead, she adapted. Cleopatra gathered what support she could, not through grand appeals, but through practical promises. She spoke of stability, of continuity, of survival. Her understanding of Egypt's needs sharpened away from the palace. She saw how fragile loyalty became when removed from spectacle. She learned how quickly order unraveled when authority lacked presence. Rome entered her calculations not as rescuer, but as variable. Civil war within Rome itself had fractured its attention. Competing leaders sought legitimacy, resources, advantage. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's internal conflict was now entangled with Rome's larger struggle. This did not guarantee safety. Created opportunity. Carefully measured, narrowly defined, but real. Her return was not dramatic. It unfolded through negotiation, leverage, and timing. Cleopatra presented herself not as victim, but as solution. Egypt, she argued, required stability. Rome required Egypt. Disorder served neither. Her case rested not on emotion, but on logic shaped by circumstance. When she returned to Alexandria, it was not as triumphant conqueror. It was as ruler restored through necessity rather than victory. Power, however, did not settle comfortably once regained. Cleopatra did not mistake return for security. The same structures remained. Shared rule continued. Rivalries persisted. She governed with awareness that authority could slip again without warning. Every decision carried weight beyond its immediate outcome. Every gesture had to balance firmness with restraint. What distinguished Cleopatra in this phase was not dominance, but endurance. She accepted that ruling Egypt now meant constant recalibration. Power was not something to be held tightly, but something to be maintained through motion. Stillness invited erosion. She remained visible, deliberate, measured. She spoke directly when needed and withheld when silence served better. Her exile and return reshaped her understanding of legitimacy. Tradition alone was insufficient. Popular support mattered, but it was fragile. Roman acknowledgement was necessary, but dangerous. Cleopatra learned to operate within this narrow corridor without illusion that it could be widened easily. Survival required precision, not grand vision. By the end of this chapter of her life, Cleopatra stood again as queen, but without comfort. Authority rested lightly, contingent on forces beyond her control. She understood now that Egypt's monarchy no longer offered shelter. It offered responsibility without safety. Power had become something she must continually reclaim through action, alignment, and restraint. This was not failure. It was adaptation. Cleopatra emerged from inheritance tempered by loss, aware that survival would depend less on what she was given than on what she could preserve. The throne remained beneath her, but it no longer promised stability. It demanded vigilance, and she was prepared to give it. Rome did not arrive in Egypt as an invitation. It arrived as momentum, carried by war, ambition, and the quiet certainty of dominance. When Julius Caesar entered Alexandria, he did so not as a guest seeking alliance, but as a victor following necessity. Rome's civil conflict had spilled outward, and Egypt stood directly in its path. Cleopatra understood this before she ever saw him. The world that approached her palace was no longer one of balanced diplomacy. It was one of unequal weight, where decisions made elsewhere would now settle heavily on Egyptian ground. Caesar came pursuing Pompey, but he also came carrying Rome itself. Its authority, its hunger for order, its expectation of compliance. Alexandria, with its libraries and rituals and layered traditions, appeared impressive, but Caesar was not a man easily impressed by ceremony. He measured value in control, stability, and utility. Egypt offered all three, but only if it could be managed. Cleopatra recognized immediately that neutrality was no longer possible. To stand apart from Rome now was to invite erasure. Her decision to meet Caesar was not theatrical in intent, though history would later romanticize it. It was calculated, precise, and timed to circumstance. Cleopatra understood the psychology of power. Caesar was accustomed to command, to men who deferred or resisted openly. She did neither. She presented herself as ruler with clarity, not defiance. Her presence was deliberate, her words economical. She did not appeal to emotion. She appealed to outcome. Caesar listened because the situation demanded it. Egypt was unstable. Its rulers were divided. Roman interests required calm, not chaos. Cleopatra offered a solution that aligned her survival with Rome's advantage. She did not disguise the imbalance between them. She acknowledged it and worked within it. That acknowledgement itself carried weight. Caesar saw not submission but competence. A ruler who understood limits was useful. The palace became a space of negotiation rather than romance. Conversations unfolded quietly, shaped by logistics, supply, and consequence. Cleopatra spoke of grain shipments, of loyalty, of Egypt's role in sustaining Rome's vast population. Caesar spoke of order, of authority, of debts still owed. Each understood the other's position clearly. This clarity formed the foundation of their alliance. It was not built on illusion. It was built on necessity. Egypt's internal conflict sharpened the imbalance. Cleopatra's brother and his advisors resisted Roman interference, clinging to the remnants of autonomy as proof of legitimacy. Caesar responded not with ideology, but with force. The fighting in Alexandria was contained, but decisive. Roman soldiers moved through streets that had not seen foreign armies in generations. Fire spread where restraint failed. The city absorbed the cost silently. Cleopatra watched these events with measured composure. She did not celebrate Roman intervention, nor did she recoil from it. She understood that Egypt's survival now required accommodation. The price was visible. Roman authority settled into the city not as occupation, but as presence that could not be ignored. Decisions once debated internally now required Roman acknowledgement. Stability returned, but it was conditional. When Cleopatra was restored fully to power, it was under Roman shadow. Her authority was affirmed, but not independent. Caesar remained in Egypt longer than necessity strictly required, managing affairs, securing loyalty, ensuring outcome. Cleopatra governed alongside him not as equal, but as partner within defined limits. Egypt regained coherence, but its autonomy narrowed. The personal connection between them, while real, never displaced the political reality beneath it. Cleopatra understood this with clarity that later narratives would soften. Caesar's attention was valuable, but temporary. His loyalty belonged to Rome, to ambition shaped far beyond Alexandria. Cleopatra's role was to ensure that Egypt remained indispensable rather than defiant. That distinction would determine survival. The birth of Caesarion later would deepen complexity, but in this moment, the alliance remained pragmatic. Cleopatra secured her throne. Caesar secured Egypt's stability and resources. Both benefited. Both understood the imbalance. Egypt no longer stood at the center of its own destiny. It stood at the edge of Rome's expanding order. The people of Egypt felt the change quietly. Taxes stabilized. Grain moved. Markets resumed their rhythms. Peace returned without ceremony. Yet beneath this calm lay recognition that something essential had shifted. The monarchy still existed, but its independence had thinned. Rome was no longer distant influence. It was active presence. Cleopatra governed with this awareness shaping every decision. She did not resist openly. She did not surrender entirely. She operated within the narrow space available, extracting advantage where possible, conceding where necessary. Her intelligence lay not in defiance, but in navigation. Survival required acceptance of imbalance without allowing it to become erasure. Caesar's eventual departure marked another transition. Egypt remained stable, but exposed. Cleopatra had gained security through alignment but also dependency. The structures supporting her rule now extended beyond Egypt's borders. Rome's internal conflicts would continue to ripple outward, and Egypt would feel each tremor. This chapter of her life closes not in triumph, but in recalibration. Cleopatra stood firmly on her throne, yet fully aware that its foundations now rested partly on Roman will. Autonomy had given way to managed survival. The imbalance introduced by Caesar's arrival would not recede. It would shape every choice that followed, binding Egypt's fate to Rome's unfolding struggle. Cleopatra did not lament this shift. She adapted to it. In doing so, she preserved Egypt longer than resistance would have allowed. Rome had entered the palace, and it would never truly leave. When Caesar departed Egypt, he left behind neither liberation nor abandonment, but a condition. The Roman presence did not withdraw with him. It settled into structures, expectations, and dependencies that would outlast any individual alliance. Cleopatra remained queen, her authority publicly affirmed, her court intact, her rituals undisturbed. Yet the terms of her rule had changed in ways that were subtle but decisive. Egypt was stable again, but stability now depended on restraint rather than strength. The early months after Caesar's departure were marked by careful stillness. Cleopatra governed with deliberation, attentive to balance rather than expansion. Grain shipments continued without interruption, flowing north toward Rome with predictable regularity. This reliability was not merely economic. It was political. Egypt's value lay increasingly in its usefulness, not its independence. Cleopatra understood this and ensured that Rome never had reason to question Egypt's role. Her success was measured not by assertion, but by absence of conflict. Within Alexandria, life resumed its familiar rhythms. The harbor filled with ships. Markets reopened. Scholars returned to the libraries. To the ordinary citizen, Egypt appeared whole again. The queen presided over ceremonies, issued decrees, resolved disputes. Outwardly, the monarchy endured. Yet beneath this continuity lay a quiet transformation. Cleopatra's authority was no longer self-contained. It existed within limits she did not define. Roman officials lingered, not governors, not occupiers, but observers and intermediaries whose presence required accommodation. Decisions that once moved directly from palace to province now passed through additional layers of consideration. Cleopatra learned to govern with patience sharpened by awareness. Every action carried external implications. Every silence was interpreted. Power had become something to manage carefully, not display. Cleopatra adapted without visible strain. Her education, her early exposure to instability, and her experience of exile had prepared her for this form of rule. She understood that endurance now required a different discipline. The image of sovereignty remained, but its substance was negotiated daily. She did not resist this reality. She mastered it. Her court reflected this shift. Advisors spoke with greater caution. Diplomacy replaced assertion as default language. Cleopatra surrounded herself with individuals skilled in administration rather than intrigue. Stability depended on predictability, and predictability required order. Egypt's internal rivalries were suppressed not through spectacle, but through quiet control. There were fewer public purges, fewer dramatic confrontations. Authority moved quietly, efficiently. The presence of Caesar Ion added complexity but not clarity. His existence carried symbolic weight, but Cleopatra did not present him as challenge or claim. She protected him without advancing him. Rome's tolerance depended on ambiguity. Cleopatra ensured that ambiguity remained intact. She understood that the future could not yet be forced, could only be delayed. This delay was not passive. Cleopatra worked continuously to strengthen Egypt's internal coherence. Agricultural reforms improved yields. Tax collection became more systematic. Infrastructure was maintained with care. These were not gestures of ambition. They were acts of preservation. Egypt's survival depended on appearing indispensable and unthreatening simultaneously. Cleopatra achieved this balance through relentless attention to detail. Her personal life receded from visibility. Cleopatra's public image became restrained, controlled. She did not cultivate adoration. She cultivated confidence. Her presence in Alexandria was constant but measured. She appeared often enough to affirm authority, rarely enough to avoid provocation. This discipline defined her reign during these years. Rome watched Egypt closely, but without urgency. Caesar's departure left Rome absorbed in its own struggles. Cleopatra benefited from this distraction, but she did not rely on it. She governed as though attention might return at any moment. This assumption shaped every policy. Egypt became predictable, reliable, calm. In a Mediterranean increasingly unsettled by Roman conflict, this calm carried value. Yet beneath this effectiveness lay recognition that success now meant something narrower than before. Cleopatra ruled, but she did not direct her own future. The structures that preserved Egypt also constrained it. Sovereignty had been replaced by stewardship. Cleopatra was no longer shaping destiny. She was delaying loss. This awareness did not embitter her. Clarified her purpose. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's survival depended on time. Each year preserved was a year gained. Each harvest delivered was proof of relevance. The future remained uncertain, but it had not yet collapsed. Preservation itself became a form of victory, even if temporary. As seasons passed, Cleopatra's competence deepened. She learned to read Roman politics from a distance, to anticipate shifts, to prepare responses without committing prematurely. Egypt's neutrality became strategic. Cleopatra positioned herself not as challenger or subordinate, but as constant. This constancy gave her leverage, limited though it was. The chapter closes in quiet continuity. Egypt stands intact, governed effectively, its queen experienced and restrained. Yet the foundations beneath this stability are altered. Rome's shadow remains, long and inescapable. Cleopatra's success is real, but bounded. She has preserved her kingdom, but the future has been delayed, not secured. This delay will matter. It will shape the choices still to come. Cleopatra has learned how to rule within constraint. The question of how long such rule can endure remains unanswered. But for now, Egypt breathes, endures, and waits. Antony arrived in the eastern Mediterranean bearing neither clarity nor resolution, only momentum. Rome was fractured, its center unstable, its future uncertain. Authority had divided itself among men who no longer pretended unity was possible. For Cleopatra, this fracture did not promise liberation, but it created space. Space to maneuver, to negotiate, to exist not merely as a dependent but as a factor. Antony represented that opening, not because he was benevolent or visionary, but because he needed what Egypt could provide. Their first encounters unfolded under the weight of reputation rather than intimacy. Antony arrived burdened by expectations shaped by war, indulgence, and legend. Cleopatra met him with precision. She understood how Rome consumed symbols and how easily it confused spectacle with substance. She offered neither submission nor defiance, but calibration. Egypt's wealth, its grain, its fleets, its stability. These were presented not as gifts, but as assets best protected through cooperation. Antony, for his part, was exhausted by command. Years of campaigning, shifting loyalties, and political erosion had dulled his certainty. He did not seek control in Egypt. He sought grounding. Cleopatra sensed this and adjusted accordingly. Their alliance formed not in passion, but in recognition of mutual vulnerability. Both stood at the edges of systems that no longer functioned as promised. Both understood that survival now required alignment rather than dominance. The court at Alexandria shifted in tone. Where Caesar's presence had imposed structure, Antony's introduced fluidity. Decision-making became slower, layered with consultation and delay. Cleopatra adapted again, this time to unpredictability. Antony was generous, impulsive, capable of loyalty and negligence in equal measure. Cleopatra learned to read his rhythms, to anticipate when firmness was required and when accommodation would preserve influence. Egypt gained relevance during these years, but relevance came with cost. Cleopatra's authority expanded outward but thinned inward. Her position depended increasingly on Antony's standing in Rome, a standing that was never secure. Military obligations pulled him away for long stretches, leaving Egypt again in suspended attention. Cleopatra ruled alone, but never independently. Every policy decision was weighed against distant Roman consequences. The people of Egypt saw little change. Trade continued. Harvests were delivered. Temples functioned. Stability persisted, and for many that was enough. Cleopatra did not cultivate grand loyalty. She cultivated continuity. Her governance remained disciplined, practical, measured. Yet beneath this discipline lay awareness that balance was illusory. Rome's conflicts were accelerating, not resolving. Antony's enemies were numerous and patient. Cleopatra watched carefully as power consolidated elsewhere. Octavian's presence grew steadily, marked by restraint rather than spectacle. His authority deepened quietly, anchored in legitimacy rather than charisma. Cleopatra understood the danger of this contrast. Antony's strength lay in presence and history. Octavian's lay in endurance and perception. Egypt's alliance tied it to momentum, not inevitability. Despite this, Cleopatra pressed forward. She had learned that hesitation invited erasure. Egypt's relevance had to be asserted continuously or not at all. She supported Antony's campaigns, supplied his forces, reinforced his image as Rome's eastern anchor. In doing so, she extended Egypt's exposure. The more Egypt mattered, the more it could be targeted. Their personal relationship remained secondary to strategy. Affection existed, but it was not indulgent. Cleopatra did not confuse closeness with safety. She remained vigilant, even as public narratives blurred intention with romance. Egypt's queen allowed stories to circulate if they softened Roman hostility or delayed scrutiny. Narrative itself became another instrument of preservation. As years passed, the illusion of balance grew heavier. Egypt stood again at the center of Mediterranean politics, but this centrality was unstable. Cleopatra's survival now depended on outcomes she did not control. Antony's decisions carried consequences Egypt would share regardless of consent. The alliance that had created space now narrowed it. Cleopatra felt the weight of this narrowing acutely. Her earlier reign had been shaped by constraint, her middle years by adaptation. Now accumulation pressed upon her. Each success demanded further commitment. Each delay increased exposure. Egypt's future became increasingly entangled with Roman resolution. The chapter closes not with rupture, but with strain. Cleopatra has aligned herself with a man and a faction that offer possibility without certainty. Egypt appears strong, engaged, relevant once more. Yet beneath this relevance lies fragility. Balance has been attempted, not achieved. The system holds, but only through effort that cannot be sustained indefinitely. Cleopatra understands this, even as she continues forward, because withdrawal now would mean immediate loss. Relevance has returned, but safety remains out of reach. The center of gravity moved west, slowly at first, then with gathering force. Cleopatra felt the change before it was spoken aloud, before messengers carried news or envoys adjusted their tone. Power, when it consolidates, alters the air around it. Rome had begun to do exactly that. Octavian's rise was not dramatic, not announced through spectacle or conquest, but through quiet accumulation. Offices aligned behind him. Legions followed orders without hesitation. Law, once flexible, hardened around his authority. The fractures that had allowed Egypt space to breathe were sealing themselves closed. From Alexandria, Rome felt distant, but its decisions arrived with increasing clarity. Antony's position weakened not through defeat, but through contrast. Where Octavian appeared disciplined, Antony appeared indulgent. Where Octavian spoke of restoration and order, Antony was associated with delay and excess. Cleopatra understood how perception functioned in Roman politics. She had watched Caesar shape it carefully, had seen how narrative could elevate or destroy. Now she saw the same mechanism turning against Antony, not because he lacked ability, but because he lacked alignment with Rome's changing appetite. Cleopatra adjusted her posture accordingly. She did not abandon Antony, nor did she escalate defiance. She narrowed her strategy, focusing on preservation rather than expansion. Egypt's resources were still valuable, but their leverage diminished as Rome unified. Grain could be sourced elsewhere. Fleets could be replaced. What Egypt offered now was not necessity, but convenience. Cleopatra knew the difference, and it unsettled her. Antony's absences grew longer. When he returned, he carried more uncertainty than command. Decisions that once flowed easily now stalled. Advisors contradicted one another. Letters from Rome arrived with veiled warnings, their language courteous but unmistakable. Cleopatra listened carefully, measuring not only words, but silence. The gaps between communication grew longer. The tone grew colder. Octavian did not threaten. He waited. In Rome, the narrative shifted decisively. Antony's alliance with Cleopatra was no longer framed as strategic, but as indulgent. Egypt itself became a symbol, not of partnership, but of distraction. Cleopatra was portrayed not as a ruler navigating survival, but as an influence undermining Roman order. She recognized the pattern immediately. Rome did not fear Egypt's power. It feared its autonomy. Cleopatra did not respond emotionally. She had learned long ago that reaction often accelerated collapse. Instead, she tightened governance at home. Taxes were regulated. Supply lines secured. Military readiness was maintained without provocation. Egypt would not give Rome pretext. Cleopatra believed that restraint might yet delay confrontation, that time could still be purchased if not secured. But time was no longer neutral. Each month strengthened Octavian's legitimacy. Each delay weakened Antony's credibility. Cleopatra watched the balance shift beyond correction. Rome no longer required negotiation. It required resolution. Egypt, once a player in Mediterranean politics, was now an obstacle to be absorbed or removed. The psychological weight of this realization was heavy, but Cleopatra did not indulge it. She had been trained to function under pressure, to separate emotion from decision. Still, the narrowing of options was undeniable. Where once she had chosen among paths, now she selected among consequences. Survival was no longer a question of skill alone, but of scale. Antony, sensing the tide, pushed for assertion. He spoke of finality, of drawing lines that could not be erased. Cleopatra listened, aware that escalation would force Rome's hand. Yet retreat offered nothing. To disengage now would not spare Egypt. It would expose it. Cleopatra weighed these outcomes carefully, understanding that inaction carried its own momentum. The world beyond Egypt grew louder. Propaganda sharpened. Rome spoke openly of betrayal, of foreign influence, of threats to tradition. Cleopatra's name was invoked not as a queen, but as a warning. She had become useful as an idea, stripped of complexity, reduced to function. Egypt's history, its antiquity, its endurance meant nothing against Rome's need for cohesion. Within Alexandria, life continued with disciplined calm. Markets opened. Temples functioned. The Nile rose and fell as it always had. Cleopatra found solace in this continuity, even as she understood it could not protect her. Civilizations often appear most stable just before absorption. Order persists until it is replaced, not destroyed. Cleopatra's strategies remained deliberate, but their scope contracted. She reinforced alliances where possible, strengthened loyalty where it still mattered, and prepared for outcomes she could not avoid. There was no panic, no spectacle of decline. Only preparation. Only acceptance that her fate now lay beyond Egypt's borders. Octavian's Rome was no longer a system that could be influenced through balance. It was becoming singular, decisive, uninterested in compromise. Cleopatra saw this clearly. She did not misjudge her position. She understood that Egypt's survival would now depend not on negotiation, but on confrontation or submission. Neither offered safety, only continuity of purpose. The chapter settles into this understanding without rupture. Cleopatra remains composed, active, attentive. Egypt stands intact, governed, disciplined. But the axis of power has shifted irreversibly. Rome decides. Egypt responds. The space between them, once filled with negotiation, has narrowed to inevitability. Cleopatra continues forward not because victory is assured, but because withdrawal no longer exists. The world that once allowed delay has closed, and history begins to move with firmer steps. The sea at Actium was calm enough to disguise what it was about to witness. Water lay flat beneath a pale sky, indifferent to the weight of history gathering above it. Cleopatra understood this indifference well. Nature had never bent for power, and it would not begin now. The fleets assembled with deliberate care, not in haste, but in recognition that what was coming could not be delayed further. This was not the beginning of a struggle. It was the end of a long narrowing. Cleopatra's presence at Actium was not born of impulse or pride. It was the result of years spent watching Rome tighten its grip, of alliances thinning until only one remained. Antony's forces stood opposite Octavian's not as equals, but as remnants of a balance that no longer existed. Cleopatra knew the numbers. She understood the logistics. She also understood the deeper reality, that leverage had already been spent before the first signal was given. Actium was not about reversal. It was about confirmation. The ships themselves reflected this truth. Heavy, burdened with expectation, they moved slowly, constrained by design and by purpose. Cleopatra observed them with the calm of someone who has measured loss in advance. She did not mistake preparation for possibility. The crews were loyal, disciplined, and tired. Loyalty could carry men through hardship, but it could not manufacture advantage where none remained. As the engagement unfolded, it did so without drama. There was no sudden collapse, no singular moment of surprise. Octavian's fleet pressed forward methodically, executing a plan shaped by patience rather than desperation. Antony's forces responded as best they could, but their movements felt reactive, shaped by pressure rather than intent. Cleopatra watched the distance between cause and effect shrink until it vanished entirely. When the moment came to withdraw, it was not confusion that prompted it, but clarity. Cleopatra recognized the shape of the outcome before it announced itself fully. To remain was not to fight harder, but to waste what little remained. She ordered retreat not out of fear, but recognition. The sea accepted the command without comment, carrying her ships away from the center of history as quietly as it had carried them toward it. This decision would later be simplified, reduced to caricature. But in the moment it was exact. Cleopatra did not abandon Antony in panic. She preserved Egypt's last fragment of agency. Actium was not lost because she left. It was already lost because Rome no longer required Egypt's participation. Power had shifted from negotiation to command, and Cleopatra was no longer positioned to alter its course. Antony followed, not as a general in control, but as a man overtaken by consequence. The fleet dispersed. The battlefield emptied itself of meaning. What remained was silence, broken only by the understanding that something irreversible had occurred. Cleopatra felt it settle not as shock, but as weight. The future had closed its doors without sound. In Alexandria, the city continued to function. Markets opened. Temples maintained their rituals. The Nile flowed as it always had. Cleopatra returned to a world that appeared intact, but whose foundations had been removed. Egypt still stood, but it no longer mattered in the way it once had. Rome would not negotiate terms now. It would deliver them. Cleopatra adjusted accordingly. There were no illusions left to maintain. She governed with precision, ensuring order where possible, dignity where necessary. She prepared not for victory, but for conclusion. Actium had not destroyed Egypt's armies alone. It had erased Egypt's ability to influence events beyond its borders. History was now something that would arrive, not something she could shape. Octavian's advance was measured, inevitable. He did not rush. He did not need to. Each step forward reinforced the truth Actium had already declared. Cleopatra watched this approach with composed awareness. She had lived her entire life within systems of power. She understood when resistance created space, and when it only delayed absorption. The emotional weight of this period did not manifest in despair. Cleopatra did not collapse inward. Instead, she narrowed her focus. Identity, legacy, memory. These were the remaining domains where choice still existed. Egypt might be lost politically, but it did not have to be erased entirely. Cleopatra believed that how an ending was carried mattered as much as the ending itself. Actium stripped away the last illusion of balance. It revealed the underlying structure that had always governed Cleopatra's reign. Egypt had survived through relevance, through utility to greater powers. Once that relevance faded, survival became temporary by definition. Cleopatra accepted this without self-deception. The chapter closes not with fire or chaos, but with stillness. Cleopatra remains in control of herself, even as control over events slips beyond reach. Actium did not end her reign in a single day. It ended her leverage. From this point forward, history would no longer respond to her strategy. It would move through her, toward a conclusion already set in motion long before the ships ever met at sea. Alexandria no longer felt like a capital in waiting but like a space already spoken for. The streets were full, the harbor busy, the granaries stocked. Yet beneath the motion there was a thinning sense of purpose. Cleopatra moved through the city with the awareness that governance had become custodial. Orders were issued, courts convened, rituals maintained, but each action carried the knowledge that authority now existed on borrowed time. Egypt still functioned, but it no longer decided its own future. The palace reflected this condition. Its halls remained cool and orderly, marble floors worn smooth by centuries of rule, walls bearing the quiet accumulation of dynasties that had risen and faded long before Rome. Cleopatra was acutely aware of this continuity. She did not experience her situation as uniquely tragic, but as historically precise. Kingdoms ended not with fire alone, but with administration, with documents prepared elsewhere, with decisions already sealed before messengers arrived. Cleopatra's days narrowed. She listened more than she spoke. Advisors brought reports not of opportunity, but of approach. Roman movements were steady, unhurried. There was no sense of pursuit, no need for urgency. Rome did not behave like a conqueror facing resistance. It behaved like an authority arriving to claim what had already been allocated. This procedural calm was more unsettling than spectacle would have been. It left no room for misinterpretation. She thought often of earlier years not with nostalgia, but with assessment. Each alliance, each concession, each calculated delay formed a clear line toward the present moment. There was no single failure to isolate. Cleopatra understood that her reign had been shaped less by error than by context. Egypt had been strong once, but strength had slowly shifted outward. By the time she was born, the balance had already tilted beyond recovery. Her role had never been to reverse that movement, only to manage its pace. The city sensed the change even if it could not articulate it. Merchants continued to trade, priests continued their rites, but conversations softened. Voices lowered. People adjusted without instruction, as populations always do when larger forces pass overhead. Cleopatra observed this without bitterness. A ruler could not ask a city to share illusions she no longer held herself. Rome's representatives arrived in stages, each bearing formal language stripped of threat. Cleopatra received them with composure, offering hospitality that acknowledged reality without surrendering dignity. She did not plead, nor did she provoke. The discussions were brief, their outcomes predetermined. Rome required compliance, not persuasion. Cleopatra's presence was acknowledged respectfully, but her authority was no longer necessary to complete the process. In private moments, Cleopatra turned inward. She reflected on what remained within her control. Not armies, not borders, not treaties. What remained was bearing. How one met the end of sovereignty mattered. Egypt's story would be told regardless of her actions, but her conduct would shape how that story closed. She resolved that it would not end in spectacle designed for another power's narrative. Her children weighed heavily on her thoughts, not as symbols, but as lives caught within consequence. She understood that Rome's interest in them was strategic, not personal. Survival within a conquered order required adaptation of a kind she could not guarantee. Cleopatra recognized that maternal instinct alone could not alter political calculus. This understanding did not break her, but it deepened the silence she carried. Alexandria itself seemed to withdraw. The sea continued its rhythm against the harbor walls, unchanged by flags or decrees. The air held the familiar scent of salt and stone. Cleopatra walked the palace grounds at measured pace, attentive to physical detail. The echo of her steps, the weight of fabric, the steady resistance of breath. These sensations grounded her in the present, preventing her thoughts from drifting into abstraction. She did not allow herself the comfort of myth. When Octavian's arrival became imminent, it carried no drama. There were no alarms, no sudden evacuations. The inevitability had already done its work. Cleopatra prepared herself not for confrontation, but for encounter. She did not expect mercy, nor did she fear cruelty. Rome's indifference was more complete than either. Cleopatra's final decisions were precise. She arranged her affairs with care, ensuring order beyond her presence. She did not rush. Haste would have suggested panic, and panic would have granted Rome a kind of victory she refused to provide. Her calm was not defiance. It was accuracy. She understood the limits of endurance and did not confuse them with hope. The emotional weight of this period lay in restraint. Cleopatra did not collapse under the knowledge that her world had ended. She accepted it as the final expression of forces long in motion. Egypt had been claimed not by her failure, but by history's momentum. Her role was not to protest this truth, but to stand within it without distortion. As Rome closed in, Cleopatra remained where she had always been, at the center of her kingdom, even as that center hollowed. She was a queen without a world, but not without self-command. The chapter of her reign did not end in noise. It ended in stillness, shaped by understanding rather than illusion, allowing the weight of finality to settle without resistance. Cleopatra's death did not rupture the world around it. There was no sudden upheaval, no violent recoil from the city she had ruled. Alexandria continued to wake, to trade, to breathe. The harbor still received ships. Temples still opened their doors. Life moved forward with the same measured persistence it always had. This continuity was not indifference, but confirmation. The end of a ruler, even one as deliberate as Cleopatra, rarely stops the machinery of history. It merely redirects it. Her absence was managed carefully. Roman authority understood the value of order, especially in a city long accustomed to hierarchy. Announcements were formal, language restrained. There was no need for public grief or celebration. Cleopatra's death closed a chapter already written. Rome had not come to witness her fall, but to finalize administration. In this sense, her death was not an event, but a conclusion aligned with what had already occurred. Octavian did not linger in Egypt longer than necessary. His interest was structural, not emotional. Egypt's wealth, its grain, its strategic position mattered far more than its former queen. The transition was executed with precision. Officials were installed. Records were transferred. The rhythms of governance adjusted without collapse. Egypt did not burn. It was absorbed. The ancient kingdom became a province. Its autonomy dissolved quietly into Rome's expanding framework. This transformation carried a particular gravity. Egypt had existed as a continuous political and cultural entity for thousands of years, adapting to conquest, dynastic change, and internal decay. Its absorption into Rome was not the first loss it had endured, but it was the final one. There would be no restoration, no revival under a new native dynasty. What followed would be continuity of land and people, but not of sovereignty. The ancient cycle closed without ceremony. Cleopatra's legacy settled into complexity almost immediately. Roman narratives began shaping her image to suit imperial needs. She was portrayed as exotic, dangerous, excessive, an embodiment of the foreign that Rome had subdued. These portrayals were not designed to understand her, but to reinforce Rome's self-image. The simplification served political purpose, transforming a disciplined ruler into a symbol of conquered otherness. Cleopatra's reality, however, resisted complete erasure. Within Egypt, memory functioned differently. Cleopatra was not remembered primarily for spectacle, but for endurance. She had ruled during contraction, not expansion. She had managed decline with competence rather than denial. Her reign did not restore Egypt's power, but it delayed its disappearance as an independent force. This distinction mattered. Survival under pressure was not weakness. It was adaptation within narrowing margins. Rome itself changed as a result of these events. With Egypt secured, Octavian's position became unassailable. The Republic, already hollowed by decades of civil war, gave way fully to imperial structure. Egypt's wealth stabilized Rome's economy and fed its population. Cleopatra's world ended as Rome's new world solidified. The exchange was unequal, but historically precise. One system exhausted itself as another consolidated. The silence following Cleopatra's death was therefore not emptiness, but transition. History rarely pauses to reflect. It moves forward, repurposing what remains. Egypt's temples would stand for centuries, its symbols reinterpreted, its gods adapted or forgotten. The land endured even as its political voice was removed. Cleopatra became part of that endurance, not as a living force, but as a marker of conclusion. Her life, when viewed without romance, revealed a pattern shaped by inevitability. She was born into decline, trained for survival, and governed under constraint. Her alliances were calculated, her decisions reactive to larger movements she could influence but not command. Cleopatra did not misjudge the world. She understood it clearly. What she lacked was leverage, not intelligence. This clarity distinguished her from the myths constructed later. The emotional weight of her story lay in restraint rather than collapse. Cleopatra did not rage against fate or seek immortality through destruction. She chose closure over spectacle. In doing so, she denied Rome a narrative of chaos and preserved a measure of control over how her reign ended. This choice aligned with her entire approach to power. Deliberate, measured, and aware of limits. As centuries passed, Cleopatra's image fractured further, absorbed into art, literature, and fantasy. Yet beneath these layers, the historical figure remained consistent. She was the last articulation of an ancient political culture attempting to survive in a world reorganized by Roman expansion. She did not fail that world. She represented its final coherence. When she died, it was not a collapse, but a release. The story concludes not with judgment, but with stillness. Cleopatra's death marked the end of a civilization's political independence and the beginning of a new imperial order. Both outcomes were already in motion long before her final days. Understanding this does not diminish her significance. It clarifies it. Cleopatra stands not as a tragic anomaly, but as the final voice of a world that had already said most of what it could. In the silence that followed, history moved on, carrying Egypt forward as territory rather than kingdom. Cleopatra's name remained, not because of scandal or romance, but because she embodied an ending with precision. The viewer is left not with spectacle, but with understanding, that endings shaped by awareness often arrive quietly, and that historical weight is measured not by noise, but by consequence. Cleopatra's death did not fracture the world around it. Alexandria did not fall into chaos, nor did Egypt erupt in grief or fury. The city continued its routines with a steadiness shaped by centuries of endurance. Ships still entered the harbor. Markets still opened at dawn. Temples still received quiet offerings. Her passing registered not as shock, but as confirmation. What had been unfolding for years had simply reached its final moment, and the machinery of history continued to turn without hesitation. Rome approached the aftermath with calculation rather than emotion. There was no need for spectacle, no requirement for vengeance. Cleopatra's death removed the last symbolic obstacle to Roman control, but it did not change the structure already in place. Officials moved carefully through Alexandria, recording assets, securing documents, and formalizing authority. The transition was administrative, not dramatic. Egypt's fate had already been decided in distant councils long before her final hours arrived. For the people of Egypt, the change was subtle but absolute. They did not wake to destruction, but to reclassification. A kingdom that had once ruled itself now answered to an empire that governed from afar. Taxes were redirected. Grain shipments recalculated. Authority no longer spoke in the language of dynastic continuity, but in the procedural tone of Roman law. Egypt endured, but it no longer determined its own future. Octavian's departure from Egypt was swift. His purpose had never been to rule from Alexandria, but to secure it as a resource within a larger design. With Egypt absorbed, Rome gained stability, wealth, and leverage. The Republic, already hollowed by decades of civil war, could no longer pretend to be what it once was. An empire was taking shape, not through proclamation, but through accumulation. Cleopatra's world closed as Octavian's solidified. Cleopatra's legacy began its transformation almost immediately. Roman narratives reshaped her image to suit imperial memory. She was rendered as excess, temptation, and danger, a foreign queen whose defeat validated Roman order. These portrayals were not reflections of her rule, but instruments of consolidation. They reduced complexity into symbolism, allowing Rome to frame conquest as moral necessity rather than strategic inevitability. Within Egypt, memory functioned differently. Cleopatra was remembered less for spectacle than for resilience. She had governed during contraction, not expansion, navigating a world where survival required restraint rather than force. Her reign did not restore Egypt's independence, but it delayed its disappearance. That delay mattered. It preserved dignity in a time when sovereignty was no longer attainable. Cleopatra herself did not seek immortality through destruction. Her final decision reflected the same discipline that shaped her rule. She understood that survival had reached its limit and chose closure over humiliation. This act was not defiance, but control exercised within narrowing margins. It denied Rome a display of chaos and preserved her authority over the manner of her ending. As years passed, Cleopatra's image fractured further, absorbed into legend and art. Yet beneath those layers, the historical figure remained intact. She was not a romantic aberration, but the final articulation of a civilization confronting its limits. Her intelligence was not brilliance for its own sake, but adaptation shaped by pressure. Her alliances were responses to structural imbalance, not personal indulgence. Egypt's absorption into Rome marked the end of a political continuity stretching back thousands of years. Temples would still stand, rituals would still echo, but authority no longer emerged from the Nile's rhythms. The land endured, but its voice changed. Cleopatra became part of that endurance, a marker of conclusion rather than collapse, remembered because she represented coherence at the end of possibility. The story ends without judgment or spectacle. Cleopatra's life resolves into historical stillness, where consequence outweighs drama. She is remembered not as a failure, but as a final expression of an ancient world that could no longer sustain itself. In that quiet understanding, the weight of history settles, allowing the listener to rest within clarity rather than noise.